So welcome to this really fascinating program that I wish I could stay for all of, but unfortunately my schedule is not such that I can, but you get to, and so I look forward to hearing from all of you about it. So first of all, I want to thank the Stern Gaffney Endowment for Israel Engagement for generously supporting this program with Dr. Karen Friedman Peleg, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Behavioral Science and the Dean of Students at the College of Management Academic Studies in Israel. She obtained her PhD at Tel Aviv University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, so we've been having a lovely time talking about being anthropologists. And Friedman Peleg was a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology and of the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley in 2018. And she is currently a visiting assistant professor and a visiting scholar at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's published articles about the ways in which the psychological concepts of trauma and resilience have come to play a significant role in shaping the meaning of the Jewish-Israeli collective identity in the last 3 decades in leading journals such as Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry and Transcultural Psychiatry. The full manuscript of her doctoral thesis, entitled A Nation on the Couch, The Politics of Trauma in Israel, was published by Magnus, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Press, in 2014, and by the University of Toronto Press in 2017. And one of the things we were just talking about was the parallels between how actually in the last year, especially since Pittsburgh, that trauma and the experience of trauma has become a way that has seeped into the American Jewish consciousness as part of American Jewish identity as well. And that parallel, I think, is very fascinating and possibly fruitful for us to pursue. So we're very grateful to have Dr. Friedman Peleg here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to be here. We spoke about it that after the incident in Pittsburgh, my mom called me crying. I will tell you in a minute about my personal story, but I told her, so Mom, why are you crying? And she said, you don't understand. They are our Iron Dome. So if something bad is happening in America to the Jewish community in America, then something bad is going to happen also to us here. And for my mom, traveling to America is like traveling to the moon. It's like beyond. And on the other side, my father always said that Israel is our homeland, but America is our dream. So it's to be here in such a meaningful social atmosphere. It's really, for me, it's very meaningful. So thank you for this opportunity. So what I'd like to do is to open by introducing you to the main argument, the core argument of my ethnographic project. Then I will focus on 2 or 3 ethnographic case studies. Thank you. 2 or 3 ethnographic case studies, and basically I'm really looking forward to hear your perspective and to learn from your experience. So here is the main argument of my project. Basically, in the last 2 decades, I've been exploring how the psychological discourse of trauma has come to play a significant role in shaping the meaning of being Jewish and Israeli today, especially under the current, maybe I should say, current political circumstances of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So how trauma as an emotional experience, but also as a socio-cultural category, one which is based on professional, scientific, evidence-based concept, we can speak about, then measure in level and severity, something we can screen and track, then present and discuss. So how did the psychological discourse of trauma has come to shape the ways of being of the Jewish Israeli community today? And just to make this, I guess, quite general argument more alive, I'd like to share with you one paragraph from an interview I conducted several years ago with a senior Jewish Israeli clinical psychologist. So I opened the interview by asking this psychologist why, from her point of view, we should consider trauma as a result of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be of particular interest in comparison, for example, to trauma as a result of sexual abuse or car accidents. And we have multiple traumatic experience of this kind in Israel as well. And I remember very clearly that she looked at me, then she said, there is a thing about a feeling of a mission. It's something that's beyond the individual. Then she said, and I'm quoting, I think that in rape, women don't feel at that moment that they represent the feminine gender. And I'm just thinking about the Me Too movement as some kind of counter argument. But this is her point of view as a Jewish Israeli clinical psychologist. So women don't feel at that moment that they represent the feminine gender. And the thing with trauma, as a result of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that people represent something. It's madness with justification, madness with meaning. It is not just some poor fellow who genetically is in that percentage of the population that gets schizophrenia. There is a feeling of a mission, a feeling of collective, a feeling of state, society, community, place, family, and of Judaism and roots. So basically, here it is. Here it is, the new moral and practical alliance of the professional discourse of trauma, trauma as an emotional experience, but also as a sociocultural category, and the ongoing process, the ongoing process of constructing the meaning of being Jewish and Israeli. This psychologist, by the way, as many of her Jewish Israeli colleagues, combines, as you can just heard, social markers of collective identity, those of national belonging, of religious identity, right? She said the Judaism and roots with the emotional experience of the individual. So, and after a conversation I had with one of the, I will tell you in a minute about my personal story, but after a conversation I had with a Holocaust survivor, I just want to make it very clear. While trauma as historical collective experience, especially, of course, the trauma of the Jewish Holocaust, has always been part of the Zionist ideology and has always served as a crucial component of the collective Jewish Israeli identity. And while after the war of 1973, the war of Yom Kippur, the Israeli society has become much more receptive to mental vulnerability, or to be more specific, to security-related mental vulnerability. Here we actually have, I think, a new articulation of this alliance between trauma and the Zionist ideology, or between trauma and the Jewish-Israeli collective identity. So, as an anthropologist, as a Jewish anthropologist who live in Israel, I can say that in the wake of the Second Palestinian Intifada, a new professional discourse about what we usually call in Israel security-related trauma has emerged, and not only emerged, but also integrated into the public discourse on national security in Israel. So with this main argument on the table, how the professional discourse of trauma has come to play a significant role in shaping the meaning of being Jewish and Israeli today, I'd like to say something about the ethnographic project itself. I must admit that my initial goal was to say something about being an anthropologist, to say something about participant observations, about in-depth interviews, about text analysis, and how and why I conducted all of this at two leading NGOs in Israel. The first one is Natal, the Israel Trauma Center for Victims of Terror and War. The second one is the ITC, the Israeli Trauma Coalition. So this was my initial goal, to explain what does it mean to conduct fieldwork in two leading NGOs in Israel. But then, and with the voice of both my mom and my dad about they are our Iron Dome, and Israel is our homeland, but America is our dream, I was thinking about my own personal story as a Jewish anthropologist who lives in Israel. And I think that to be honest, more than any anthropological training, this part of my identity is the driving force behind my ethnographic research, with, I think, more than one trauma to deal with. So instead of saying something about participant observations or about in-depth interviews, please allow me to say that I was born and raised in a small kibbutz in the north of Israel. It's like a little dot on the map, but as many other dots on the Israeli map, there is actually a huge political drama behind it. My kibbutz, as many other kibbutzim in Israel, served as a socio-political hub of the Zionist ideology, where let's say, the pioneering mentality of Israel and the socialist collective values of Israel were put into practice. I mean, we ate in a communal dining room. We slept in the children's house, separated from our parents. We grew up while learning, believe me, time after time, that the group, the community, the nation are much more important than us as individuals. And all of us, without exemption, served in the Israeli military. We grew up highly aware of the fact that our kibbutz was established in 1947 by Jewish immigrants, all of them Holocaust survivors. We grew up highly aware of the fact that the kibbutz was established near what later has named the Green Line, the demarcation line set out as a part of the agreements between the armies of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria after the War of 1948. At the same time, we grew up highly aware of the fact that in 1951, the kibbutz was moved 3 kilometers east to its current location. And we knew that this piece of land, we knew it as children, had previously been a Palestinian village named El Jalame. So this is not some kind of historical account. I put it on the paper as a part of my own, it's a common knowledge for me, for everyone in our kibbutz. We grew up highly aware of the fact that after the war of 1948, Israel emptied El Jalame. The Palestinians who lived there were expelled by the Israeli military. And we even knew that, in fact, the Palestinian petitioned the Israeli Supreme Court for permission to return, which was actually granted in June 1952. However, in August 1953, and here I know I need to be very careful, either the kibbutz member themselves, all of them Holocaust survivors, or the Israeli military blew up the remaining houses in El Jalame, and by doing so, made sure that the Palestinian landowners would never return. So, in many ways, I am the story I'm telling you. I was born from and into this multi-layered narrative of trauma, to the Zionist ideology, the Jewish Holocaust, and the Palestinian disaster of 1948. And I think that in many ways, the question of being Jewish and Israeli today is a question that I'm trying to address on a daily basis. And to understand, I mean, I'm thinking about my mom. For my mom, there is no multi-layered narrative of trauma. There is only one trauma. This is, for her, it's the Jewish trauma, because my mom was born in Jerusalem, and she was a child during the War of 1948. So from her point of view, there was no choice but to do this and that in order to create a Jewish existence in Israel. But I'm trying to offer a more nuanced perspective. So I'm eager to hear your perspective. So after this probably too long introduction, what I'd like to do is to demonstrate the social dynamic, the professional and public dynamics surrounding the psychological discourse of trauma. And I will start with the context of the Israeli military, and I will try to offer, not to offer an answer, but just to give one example of how Jewish Israeli trauma experts have come to negotiate the socio-political drama of combat military service based on the discourse of trauma. So I'm going to share with you one, I know, very painful story, but I was exposed to it as a part of being an anthropologist. So this is going to be the first context. And the second one will be the context of the second and last one will be the context of Israel's southern periphery, and how the new, and this is fascinating, the new aid policy, this is the government's aid policy of building resilience. And just to make it very clear, after a comment I received when I gave a talk at Brandeis in Boston, this is not my name. This is the name that the Israeli authorities gave to their new aid policy, building resilience. So how this new aid policy of building resilience has served as a catalyst for another form of negotiation, this time between Jewish Israeli trauma experts, local practitioners, and here I'm going to present also the point of view of Bedouin local practitioners who, since the war in Gaza in 2014, have been also exposed to rocket fire from Gaza, and residents. Basically, I think that this is a negotiation over the meaning of home and belonging. So I'm going to present two ethnographic examples of this new social dynamic surrounding trauma and PTSD in Israel. And I'd like to open with the context of the Israeli military and with the story of Udi. I'd like to say that this is a very painful story, but for sure it was not the only one that I've heard. In November 2005, David, a young clinical psychologist from Natal, presented the case of one of his new patients, Udi. Speaking at length, David, the psychologist, delivered pieces of information about Udi, like a list. You're going to see a list, and this is basically what he provided. Single, parents divorced. I mean, I'm sitting there taking notes, and this was like single parents divorced, the father with a new family, the mother unemployed, has learning difficulties, unable to fall in love or to live with a partner, previously lived in the US, India, and Australia, smokes drugs, and drinks alcohol. This was the opening remarks of David, the psychologist. After that, he focused on one particular incident from Udi's military service in the IDF, in the Israeli military. At that night, Udi's army unit had operated in the border of Israel and Lebanon, together with another IDF unit. And according to David, the psychologist, the two units had not practiced together prior to going into this specific military action. And this fact apparently led to a tragic consequence. David, speaking on behalf of his patient, I mean, using the patient's exact words, provided this description. While clearing a route, we were engaged. And because we hadn't practiced together, we fired at the other unit and assaulted them. He leapt over a low wall of stones. The major of the other unit was lying on the ground. He had been hit. Now the psychologist is once again quoting the patient. And when I saw him over there, lying down, I shot several rounds in his chest. he defended himself, threw his arms over his head, and then I put a bullet in his head. At that point, I just want, like, I don't need to be a psychologist, neither you. I just want to say that clearly this story of Udi fits. There is a perfect match to the clinical definition of PTSD, a distinctive and unusual triggering factor, and indeed, right after that, David, the psychologist, presented like a series of symptoms, recurrent pictures when he hears reports about military incidents and can hardly sleep, worried about what the future holds, angry and frustrated to the point of wanting to take a punching bag and slam into it. Actually, David, the psychologist, said that when Udi was thinking of canceling one of their meetings, David texted him a message, "Udi, you decide." And David said that Udi texted him back, "Hey, listen, the last time I decided something, I killed someone I wasn't supposed to kill." So then David described their first meeting. During our first meeting, I saw a slender young man, thinning hair, black rings under his eyes, projecting a deep and vast sadness. He talks about wanting to get out of the situation. Actually, he cannot get himself up off the sofa. And then this piece of information I already shared with you. The last time I decided something, I killed someone I wasn't supposed to kill. So we have this perfect match, clinical match between Udi's story and the clinical definition of PTSD. However, immediately after David completed this case presentation, a bitter debate had started between his colleagues, all of them Jewish Israeli trauma experts. And this is where we can see how trauma has actually come to be a focus of negotiation. Because, listen to this, immediately after he completed, Dr. Shai Gur, the psychiatrist, said, "It sounds like there is a problem in understanding the cause. He, Udi, the patient, strongly connects action with aggression and also acts that way. Even the central traumatic event, it sounds as if there was something he did that is beyond a problem of practice." Basically, he tried to suggest that maybe there is something more here. And another clinical psychologist agreed, "Yes, I suppose you could see it was one of our soldiers." Dr. Itamar Barnea, the head psychologist of the team, said, "He is delivering a message that can paralyze: helplessness and being overactive. He killed someone. For me, the difficult part was that he said that the other young man raised his arms and he shot him in the head. And I also know where the difficulty inside me comes from. I will just say very briefly that Itamar Bernea served as a pilot in the Israeli Air Force during the war of 1973, the war of Yom Kippur. He was shot down and badly wounded and spent 8 long months in Syrian captivity. So this is why he said, I also know where that difficulty inside me comes from. Michal, a social worker, asked, what do you do with a patient who was killed? What happens to us when we face someone in whom we discover aggression? It isn't simple facing those patients. Sorrow and pain, that's easier for me, but these places, they're not simple. And another social worker agreed, there is a very great difficulty when inside the trauma there is a component of aggression and guilt as opposed to trauma that happened to him. So I think that basically we have here a multivocal dialogue that provides a good indication of the negotiation surrounding trauma as a result of combat military service, and how complicated it was to translate a military drama into a psychological drama, into an emotional drama. And as you can just hear, this debate or this negotiation was not about Uri's mental condition, but rather regarding the legitimate position of Uri as a patient. Because even though Uri's mental condition was in a perfect match with the mental disorder of PTSD, Uri himself did not fit the category of the pure victim, the person who should and ought to be treated and to be helped. Uri was not someone at whom aggression had been directed, as one of the therapists said, but rather he himself had been the aggressors. And I think that one of the therapists really captures the essence of this tense gap between the position of a victim and the aggressor when she asked, what do you do with a patient who was killed? Because, in fact, she knows that since the first and the second intifadas, this question has become quite prominent in Israel. It is not just Udi at this night during this specific military action. She knows, and her colleagues know, that there are many Udis out there. And it's only a matter of time until the next Udi will be seated on the couch, and the position of the victim and the position of the aggressor will actually be united into the same person, the patient, who basically is asking for their professional support. So what do we do with a patient who is killed? The answer is apparently it depends. And it depends not so much on the patient's mental condition, but rather on the level of the identification the therapists have with their patients. Because, listen, for example, to this. As a way to conclude the negotiation, Sar Uzieli, the head of the team, said listen, guys, he could have won the achievement of his life, because if it was a terrorist, he would have come out a hero. The situation is so chaotic. Two forces engaging each other, a huge mess. In the heat of the moment, it's either him or me. It's a split second in which you have to make a decision. Precisely in a case where he was on the ball, he had his momentum, he was proactive, something terrible happened. It doesn't matter what he does. Even if it's appropriate, it's bad. That's the trauma. So, just to conclude our first ethnographic case study, to answer the question, what do you do with a patient who is killed? I think that you can see how the head of the team has tried to reestablish Uri's legitimate position as a victim of trauma, even though he was the aggressor, and as a patient. In many ways, this is a sociocultural analysis of the situation rather than a pure psychological analysis. And I'm moving to the second and the last ethnographic case study, the context of Israel's southern periphery. Here, the point of departure of this second and last case is a new aid policy of the Israeli government that has been applied in the last decade in Israel's southern periphery with this specific name of building resilience. This psychosocial, scientific-oriented concept of resilience, which is based on the assumption that every one of us has not only the ability, but also the responsibility to cope, to bounce back in the face of adversity. So this concept of resilience has been integrated into the policy of the Israeli authorities along the border with Gaza. In fact, and with images like this one, emphasizing the threat of the rockets from Gaza towards Israel, since 2008, 6 resilience centers, 8 platforms were established in Israel's southern periphery, included one directed to the Bedouin community that lives in this area. So, as a part of this new effort, as an anthropologist, I can hear and see all the time the process of introducing a new resilience-oriented vocabulary to the general public, but especially to those communities who live near the border with fascinating new terms. I still don't know what to do with them, but listen to this: emotional first aid, anxiety treatment procedures, and titles like hotlines are the finger on the pulse of the nation's emotional health. And this is something new. Israelis usually don't speak in those terms about facing a war. One of the Holocaust survivors from my kibbutz said, "What the hell is going on? We should know how to cope. I mean, we survived much worse situations. So why are they speaking about emotional first aid, hotlines are and this and that?" For me, as an anthropologist, it was especially interesting to see how this, let's say, new package of aid, like this new plan to build resilience, serves as a catalyst for negotiation, once again between Jewish Israeli trauma experts, and this time also local practitioners and residents over the meaning of daily experiences of home and belonging. And I will tell you, local practitioners and residents, Jewish and Bedouin alike, this is so interesting, highlight other sources of trauma that threaten a secure sense of home and belonging rather than the security one. So, for example, when a workshop was conducted in one of the neighborhoods in Sderot, a town near the border, Yosef, the psychologist, I was there as an anthropologist, he opened the session with this question: who is responsible? And this is a workshop that has been conducted as a part of this new effort of building resilience. So he opened with asking, who is responsible for calming us, the government or ourselves? So he told me after that, he meant that they will say, this is our responsibility. But no, Slava, a Russian immigrant who arrived in Sderot a few years before the rocket attacks began, said, the government, not us. The Qassams rockets make the population miserable. They don't believe in the government. I will try, and this is to say something like this in Israel. It's really huge. I will try not to send my son and daughter to the IDF, the Israeli military. I have no faith. Our plan, and to say this while I'm standing here, our plan is to learn English and leave Israel. What do they say in the center of the country? And then he looked at me because he knew I live in Tel Aviv. There are Qassams over there, as if we are second-class citizens. And then Yosef, the psychologist, said there is a lot of anger today. This is like a very typical psychological response. Dvora, she lives in Sderot for many, many years. She actually agreed with Slava. I feel that all the government, she meant left-oriented, right-oriented, they want the population to be helpless. Perhaps we need to set up our Sderot scouts and start firing Qassams too. Now, we have the strongest military in the Middle East, but people feel so vulnerable. Slava said, yesterday they said, you are Sderot, you are good. Today they say, you are Sderot, you are garbage. How can I send my son to the military? Who will thank you if you have no son because he served in the military? Who? You will be invited to Jerusalem on Memorial Day to stand in the background. Then, Rivka, she is an Ethiopian immigrant who arrived in Sderot in the early 80s. She said, everybody says about us in Sderot, a few Moroccans, a few Ethiopians, and a few Israelis who didn't know what they were doing. Yosef, the psychologist, tried to redirect the session. He said, I plan to give you some practical tools to help people calm down if you see they are stressed. I want to put on some soft, pleasant music. And they were like, what? And each will do what he or she wants. Then after a few moments, Rivka, the Ethiopian immigrant, said to him sarcastically, it suits to Ashkenazim, to European Jews, this music. Maybe they will find it helpful. And I just want to say that after this session, Yosef told me this was a disaster. But a week after that, everyone, I told him and myself, nobody will arrive, because it was a disaster. And everyone came, once again, But why? And I'm asking myself why they keep coming, but they are coming and complaining about the government and express this political resistance. So you can see very clearly the gap between the therapist's psychological narrative. I mean, basically, he tried to reshape the subjective reality of the residents, of the participants, while they themselves offered a much more political narrative. Basically, they pointed out the objective difficulties of the external reality, and they expressed a political protest against the government, against the Israeli military, and other symbols of the state, like the Memorial Day in Jerusalem. Now, interestingly enough, a quite similar type of criticism we can find among local Bedouin practitioners who live in the northeastern Negev. And you can see here basically the impossible mix of Israel's southern periphery. So we have the Jewish cities and towns like Beersheba and Arad and Dimona, and the Bedouin towns of Rahat, Lakia, Hura, Tel Sheva, and also there are, I should mention, multiple unrecognized Bedouin villages in this area. Now, since the military operation of Protective Edge in the summer of 2014, all those Bedouin towns have come to be exposed to the same security threat as their Jewish neighbors. So actually, I can hear time after time critical voices of local Bedouin practitioners against the Israeli government, but also against cultural codes and social values of the Bedouin community itself, not only against the Israeli government, especially against this pattern. Now, I live in Israel, and I couldn't believe how dominant this kinship arrangement of polygamy is, or some kind of a cultural arrangement that allows one man to be married to more than one woman. Now, as you will hear in a minute, for them, for many of them, for many women, this is the source of the trauma, not the rocket of Hamas. As one of the Ibrahim, he said, Ibrahim Abu Abed, he is a clinical psychologist, and he told me, I'm not judging, but polygamy has many consequences, especially on the children's mental well-being. In the same elementary school, for example, there are 16 children who are siblings. They have the same father, but they are from 4 different mothers. So he then explained, forget about illegal. Let's put this question to the side for a moment. For me, the most important thing is that in many cases, once the man married another woman, they abandon the first wife. And just imagine the envy between the children. So you can see how he, as many of his colleagues, emphasized other sources of trauma rather than the security-related one. At the same time, I must say that, and this is going to be my last and final example, from their, let's say, broken sense of home, new opportunities to reconstitute their belonging to Israel. New opportunities were born out of this new aid policy of building resilience. Out of this new effort to recognize trauma as a part of the Jewish-Israeli experience, and also maybe we can extend it to other non-Jewish communities. So last year I conducted an interview with another Bedouin psychologist. His name is also Ibrahim, and you will understand in a minute why I didn't change his name. Ibrahim is the head of the clinical team at the Resilience Center that was established to the Bedouin community. And he shared with me a wonderful story from his work as a psychologist in one of the elementary schools in the Jewish city of Beersheba, a Jewish city near Rahat. He shared this story. I had a Jewish patient, a young boy, and his mother called me. She was in such need, desperately in need of help. And right away, in the beginning of the conversation, I said, "Hi, it's Ibrahim speaking." And I emphasize the Arabic accent, so she would know. So the shock would not be in the room, that she would understand her son's therapist is an Arab Bedouin. In our first meeting, I asked the boy, "Can you describe for me what you feel right now?" Now, this boy, just to make it very clear, lives in Beersheba. And a rocket was basically landed very close to his building. "Can you describe for me what you feel right now?" And the boy said, "I'm afraid." I asked him, "What are you most afraid of?" And he said, "Of Arabs." I looked at him and didn't know what to say. I'm an Arab Bedouin. His therapist is an Arab. Then the boy, he's a very smart boy, asked me, "What is your name?" And we know that name is a strong, powerful social marker of identity. Even though I guessed his mom had already told him my name, and maybe she had already told him that I'm Arab. But I answered his question directly, and I said, "My name is Ibrahim." And the boy looked at me and asked, "Can I call you Avi?" Now, this is, it's beautiful in a way, because Avi, of course, is a shortened version of Avraham, a common first name in Israel, and the parallel Hebrew version of the name Ibrahim in Arabic. So this smart boy asked, "Can I call you Avi?" Ibrahim told me he was about to ask me to convert or something to Judaism. "Can I call you Avi?" And I agreed. I agreed so we could start to build something together, so we could start a process, some kind of a therapeutic process. And we did. We started. And after a couple of months, the boy suddenly said, in the middle of one of our sessions, "So, okay, from now on, I can call you Ibrahim." So I'd like to conclude by sharing with you my anthropological impression that what we have here represents, in fact, a critical moment in the evolution of the Zionist ideology, because I think that the new conversation about trauma and about resilience actually represents a new way, experiences of home and belonging and Judaism have been articulated in contemporary Israel because, listen, rooted in scientific discourse rather than the political charged discourse of us versus them, I think that the equation of building resilience against trauma renders a novel means through contemporary scientific-oriented vocabulary to combine two Zionist cornerstones, victimhood and aggression. I think that in many ways, trauma, these clinical labels of trauma and PTSD offer a new articulation of the well-familiar standpoint or experience of victimhood in Israel. On the other hand, the psychological concept of resilience offer a new articulation of aggression. So we have this new, less politicized, more neutral articulation of victimhood, aggression, and the link between them. And this new articulation carries with it new opportunities, new forms of negotiations, but also new opportunities to think about being Jewish and Israeli today. In turn, I think that engaging with trauma and with the new aid policy of building resilience in their private homes and communities open a door for local practitioners and residents, Jewish and Bedouin alike, into the Israeli discourse, allowing them not only to express critical voices, but also to integrate those voices and their broken senses of home. And you heard Slava and Rivka and Dvora and Ibrahim. So to integrate their broken senses of home and belonging into the national discourse in Israel. And I think it was from this broken and inconsistent experience of home that maybe, just maybe, and maybe I'm too optimistic, but a new creative sense of home and belonging might emerge, as the story of Ibrahim and his Jewish client implied. A new fragile but meaningful experience of home has been created, one which is based on being a Muslim Bedouin or Arab Bedouin in a Jewish state, to be the therapist of a young Jewish boy who is afraid of Arabs, to be named Ibrahim, then Avi, then Ibrahim once again. So maybe both Ibrahim and the young Jewish boy offered to us to think, or they're trying to push us to think beyond the familiar equation of us versus them. And in that sense, I think that the new professional discourse about trauma and resilience in Israel opens up at least new conversation about what does it mean to be Jewish and Israeli today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes.
First off, thank you for very thought-provoking, lot to chew on here. Just a couple of clarification questions that were coming up for me. One is, I'm assuming, how do you say resilience first of all in Hebrew?
In Hebrew, chosen.
Chosen, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was assuming that, my read was that this new vocabulary of resilience is probably a positive thing, although I wasn't sure, so that was one question. I wasn't sure about the old kibbutznik who said, why are they talking about this, whether, whether it's positive. And I was wondering if you could sort of draw that link again between this new vocabulary of resilience connected to aggression and sort of what that link is.
Okay, thank you so much. Great questions. The positive aspect. Clearly, the Israeli authorities try to offer the residents a frame of meaning because the impression is that we don't have a military solution. We don't have a political solution. So now we need to manage and to contain the stress and the fears, and we need to offer the residents something new. Sometimes the residents themselves, or, like this Holocaust survivor from my kibbutz, interpret these new terms as too emotional and like working in the opposite direction, that instead of like emphasize strength, they actually teach people that they are very vulnerable. I mean, you can speak with residents in Sderot, they don't really, sometimes they feel that the psychologists really eager to help. We don't need your help. We are fine. We have our own coping mechanisms. Please bring financial resources, organizational resources for other difficulties we have here. The Qassams, it's not the only thing, and it's true, of course. What about, even in Sderot, poverty, children at risk within their private home? I mean, what you consider to be a safe zone, it is actually not a safe zone. So this is I think the negotiation about resilience. And the link with aggression, I think that delivering this message of you need to cope with the Qassams, it's just another way to say you need to be warriors in your private homes instead of in the battlefield. You need to be strong and you need to cope, and please don't leave because we need you here as a part of the front line. So this is a new way to speak about patriotism. I mean, I remember the Ministry of Defense, Moshe Boogie Ya'alon, during the war in Gaza, he said this is a test. This is a test not for the Israeli military. The Israeli military will be just fine. This is a test for you as residents. This is a test for us as a society. This is a test for our resilience. So resilience, the way political leaders adopted this concept, it's quite amazing. As a new way, more neutral, less politicized way to say, this is part of, and by the way, not only as a new way to articulate patriotism, heroism, to be devoted to this collective mission of building a state, but also, I think, as a way to transfer, and this is huge, to transfer the responsibility from, the military should protect them, not they need to protect themselves by listening to a calming music, for example. But this is a new way to transfer the responsibility to the communities themselves. This is part of your task, to bounce back, to continue to go to school, to continue to go to work, unless the military said, no, something different. Yes.
Is it resented, generally as being kind of patronizing, overburdened, this whole concept of resilience and building resilience?
This is a wonderful question. So basically, I think that this is more than anything, from my perspective, this is a new way of communication between local communities and the Israeli authorities. Because, listen, the local Bedouin practitioners and even local Jewish practitioners, they basically take this concept of resilience from the government's protocol and they translated it into something different. There is an interesting process of translation here. Especially among the Bedouins, they told me they don't have a parallel word to chosen in Hebrew or to resilience in English. So as one of them told me, I interviewed her while her husband is in the room, and she said, we need to give it our own local meaning. So we are trying to navigate the tensions because we need to mediate this concept to our community. So it's not only about like power relations, there are power relations here, but also there is some kind of a cultural translation, which is a very interesting process. Yes?
How do you apply resilience to Udi's situation?
This is a wonderful question. Udi's, the Israeli soldier, I can only say that I remember that David, his psychologist, told me, but this was like, I didn't include it because this was an informal conversation, that immediately after the incident, Udi came to his officer and said, please allow me to go to the family and to apologize. To say, hey, this was an incident of what we call in Israel a friendly fire. It was me. And they refused to allow him. Now, we know, based on research, that forgiveness and this whole act might have a clear therapeutic meaning. I think that Udi is punishing himself by being, with drugs and the alcohol, etc. But I guess that, and the Israeli military, maybe they have their own, why they didn't allow him to do it. But David, the psychologist, told me if they would allow him to come to the family, to confess or just to share with them, things might be different, but for sure, from the perspective, and by the way, this is beyond my my expertise, but many of those Israeli soldiers who made those mistakes and suffered from severe PTSD have issues with their fathers as a part of Israel, as a warrior society, and with masculinity that needs to be expressed as a part of your military service. David said that Udi didn't know, he felt more comfortable to confess to the family of his friend, but he said, I cannot share this with my own parents, never, because it will kill my dad. This was his own words, that if my dad will know that I did something like this, I made this, and as one of them said, he could be a hero if this was really so I think that forgiveness might be a crucial component here, but obviously, and as I understood, Udi is still struggling with severe PTSD symptoms. Yes?
Yeah, well, the Udi story does, because there seem to be a lot of loose ends. I'm wondering, what did the Army investigation find? It's a strange story because it
I agree.
turned over. There are some markings on the front, and you would assume that there would be some recognition, unless you go immediately to the Army and say, all they want is a killing machine. They don't want someone who thinks at all, in which case I think some of the other things are called into question. And you seem to be taking that position. If he killed the terrorists, it would be okay. Is that basically what you're saying, that the Israeli army wants killing machines?
Any army does. Any military does.
Without thought. without thought at all.
I will just say that it's so interesting because I've never thought about this aspect of official investigation of what happened. And one of my students at Penn asked me the same question. And then I realized that basically we don't know. We don't classify those incidents unless, and I'm thinking about the case of, for example, Elor Azaria, who shot an Israeli soldier who shot a terrorist in his head, but while the terrorist was like already unarmed, etc. Then there was an investigation, but in such what he described as a mess, nobody knows for sure what happened, why. And I think that the comments made by Sar Uzieli at the end of the discussion, listen, guys, in Hebrew he said, chevre. It's a very intimate way to communicate in Israel. Like, listen, guys, this is such a chaotic situation. He basically said, don't judge him like too harshly because it might happen like maybe to any of us. Like, and this is a huge problem in Israel with many, as she said, many Udis out there. Yes.
I want to make two comments. One is that even here in our Philadelphia VA, there are therapists who are working on the same issue for soldiers who have been impacted and have been aggressors in their role. That forgiveness and the therapies around forgiveness have become very important, not necessarily directly to the victim, but to society. So there's actually work being done around groups who go and need to present their stories and have other people who are outside of the military hear them, acknowledge them, and grant them forgiveness in a ceremony. And I know a
Really?
psychologist who does work on this. I'd be happy to connect you. And he actually comes from the Quaker faith, so it's a really interesting context to have that. So I did want to raise that. From my perspective, or my question, is I come as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor who grew up in Israel. I'm a psychologist, and the only word I can use is there's an Israeli way of sort of poo-pooing the concept of trauma, right, from that generation. So I'm sort of curious from your point of view how generational this feels. You mentioned this is the past 30 years. My mother came to the United States, how old am I? 40 years ago. And so do you feel that generational shift? How do you see the older generation looking upon this in the younger generation?
So for sure, number one, there is a generational issue here. We never heard as children the stories of the Holocaust survivors in our kibbutz. We just knew they are Holocaust survivors, number one, because of the numbers, tattoos on their arms. But I think that for them, I remember one of them said, there is nothing to tell because this is the past. We need to focus on the present and on the future. And I think that for them, this whole new acknowledgement of trauma and PTSD and resilience as a way to cope, this is really, as one of them told me, this is not the Israel we established. I mean, because they didn't speak about their own trauma as a part of building. I mean, Bella, the senior kibbutz member, she survived Auschwitz, and she said, we came here to build. She lost a husband and a child. She came to the kibbutz. She remarried. She said, we came to build a new nation, a new Jew. She said, I don't want to be once again, and this is extremely interesting, this diasporic. And I even, in Hebrew, she said, a Yehudi Yashan, the old Jew. We need to be the new Jews. We need to be strong, and we don't need to speak about those things. It's not going to be very helpful. And I think that they look at all of this and they don't know how, they really feel what the hell is going on. I mean, this is like, and they have this moral judgment of, if we survived the concentration camps, you need, now it's, they might say it like very clearly, now it's your turn to survive and to protect our country and not to speak about all the time about fears, about trauma. You're just doing the opposite. You're encouraging. And by the way, there is, as a psychologist, you probably know that might be something here that when you speak about PTSD, you basically offer, Young Hacking, he's a very, very smart philosopher, and he said you offer people a new way to define themselves, a new way to be. So if trauma has come to serve such a meaningful role in shaping our identities as Israelis, this is something that it's quite, I remember when I was in Berkeley, my daughter, a friend came to her, and my daughter barely speaks English, but the other child from Berkeley asked her, so did you come from the Bible or something like this? And I was like, oh, and my daughter immediately said, oh, yes, I did come. And I was, what's going on? And then the other girls asked her, so did you meet the great three patriarchs? And my daughter said, yes, for sure. And then she asked her, what's their names? And my daughter said, Abraham, Isaac, and Rabin, the Israeli prime minister. And I was like, no, it's not. And she told me, Mom, don't I like that? So now, and I think about my daughter and the way she might even use, trauma as a new tool to shape her identity. So the other day, last year, she said, I want to be Anne Frank. And this is so interesting because, by the way, and this is another fascinating issue, there is a new way to teach Israeli children about the Holocaust. And this is based on this clinical label of trauma. They know basically, in terms of facts, nothing. But they know something about the emotional experience because the teacher speaks with them about what does it mean and the oppression and so psychology and trauma really both have come to shape the meaning of, I think, being, and this is, from a generational perspective, this is amazing process. Yes.
Me?
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like it if you could say a little bit more about how the example of polygamy in the Bedouin subgroup fits in with your thesis. It's related to when you were saying that people were saying it's not just the rockets. There are other sources of trauma.
Right.
How do the other sources of trauma fit in with your
So
presentation?
basically, it obviously doesn't fit to the agenda of the authorities, but the local practitioners on the ground, acknowledging the fact that there are other sources, much more dominant sources of trauma, like polygamy, they have been trying to transfer financial and organizational resources in order to build resilience, for example, among young women. I met with a young Bedouin. She's 18 years old. She never, ever left Rat, this tiny Bedouin town. She hasn't visited in Beersheba, for example. So they are trying to build workshops for building resilience, especially to young, not only female, but also male Bedouins, as a part of this new effort to build resilience. Now, this is obviously not the intention of the Israeli authorities, but this is the cultural translation mechanism. Okay, we will take your concept of resilience and we will give it another meaning and we'll create new therapeutic interventions in order to enhance and to foster some kind of a dialogue within our communities.
Good question over here. I work at the VA hospital here in Philadelphia. I'm not a psychologist, I'm an internist. I see many people with PTSD.
American
Soldiers, and the American Army screens them after every single deployment for PTSD. and other psychological responses to the trauma that they've been through. And the one question I don't know is how they screen them when they're entering. But I'm wondering how much of this, and it's very detailed screening, because I see the results of it and I see the questions they ask. The question I have is, I mean, it's interesting to me that the person who shot the terrorist actually is going to go to jail now, according to the newspapers. Finally, the Israeli courts decided that that person's, going to jail. But the Americans are hoping, at least, that they can try to prevent episodes from occurring in the first place by doing lots of screening for psychiatric issues. And I wonder how much the Israeli army does of that nature.
My impression is that it's not, like we don't have these very high professional standards. And this is the interesting clash between Israel as a warrior society. This is a mandatory military service that we have. And there is this social expectations. I remember the public discussion in Israel after the incident with the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who spent 5 years in Hamas captivity, and about the way he functioned during the incident. Still, the cultural assumption is that Israelis, especially Israelis, males, need to know how to cope, and therefore I think that this discourse of trauma and resilience is prominent in the military, but not to the extent you just described in the American military. Yes.
Excuse me 1 minute. This is a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll just take 1 or 2 more questions.
Perfect.
And then we'll end.
There was an article in Haaretz recently about the minimal screening that Israel does, or the expectation that the soldiers have. But for the soldiers, the lone soldiers that go over there from other countries, there's none, and there's this high rate of suicides, and it's become an issue, and they're trying to figure out what to do with that, and that's even worse.
I can speak to that because my daughter's a lone soldier.
Yeah.
She just went over, she's joining the Army, she is about to go on active duty, and they're very concerned about lone soldiers. They interviewed me to see whether or not, because they saw that lone soldiers who had no siblings were at a much higher rate of risk, they made me send the birth certificate of her brother to prove that she had a brother. So I think that
I'm not surprised by that.
soldiers, I think they're very tuned into that. Now, there may be very different issues for the others.
But of course, because Israel still thinks about itself as a very close, family-oriented society. So when this is a very interesting category in Israel of the lonely soldiers or something like. So I'm not surprised by this difference. Yes.
I came down from Manhattan. I work at the Manhattan VA. I'm a psychologist, and I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy that people are engaged and listening and talking about these things. And when you talk about forgiveness, I'm thinking about how so many of the young Israelis are going to India, and they're going
It's
to,
true.
I don't know what they're finding in Australia, maybe the beer, I have no idea. But they're going, they're looking everywhere. And, we talk about moral injury here. So there's the PTSD, but we're also talking about moral injury. And, so how do we bring what the richness of our Jewish whatever to Israel, where they're not forced by this rabbinate where they don't have to search. I have American military who their college brings them down to the Bahamas. The students, I work with student veterans, brings them down to the Bahamas, and they go to a yoga center in the Bahamas that's owned and run by 2 Israelis.
Wow.
A yoga center in the Bahamas, and they're like, we don't know why the Israelis are doing that, but it's fascinating to me. The Holocaust survivors had that situation. It's a new generation.
Right.
They have to talk about these things because this next generation is really suffering.
So I agree, and there is still these cultural codes of masculinity in Israel. I can see it with my nephew and with this ideal type of the new Israeli as a combat soldier who basically can cope with everything. And when they arrived to therapy, as one of the senior psychologists from Natal told me, sometimes it's too little, too late. And the Israeli military, for sure, doesn't recognize the meaning of forgiveness, for example. And Udi's case, it's just, a paradigmatic case study in that sense. But this is the power and the limits of the trauma discourse in Israel. So this is a warrior society with this mission of building a new collective identity, but then you have to speak about trauma because it just becomes, so prominent. And there are those gaps and tensions. And obviously, I think maybe as some kind of a concluding remark that we have a lot to learn from your experience, even though Israelis think that about security, we can teach everyone else. But as my mom said, you are our Iron Dome, and there is something about it. Thank you so much. Thank you.